The lights activate before the car fully stops. License and registration. A response is given once in the correct role. A badge is produced. It is not examined. That doesn't look right. The badge stays where it is. Hands on the vehicle. Don't move. The unmarked sedan comes to rest on the shoulder of Highway 95. Gravel shifts under the tires. The engine remains on. The dash clock reads 11:47 p.m. Ethan Walker keeps both hands on the steering wheel. His posture stays fixed. He looks forward through the windshield. The road ahead is empty. The mirrors show reflected light and dark pavement. In the back seat, Daniel Ross sits upright. His wrists are secured together. His feet are planted on the floor. His eyes remain forward. He does not move. He does not speak. A flashlight reaches the driver's window. License and registration. Officer Mark Reynolds says. Ethan lowers the glass. He answers once. The response does not change what follows. The light shifts to the passenger side. Caleb Walker remains seated. Hands visible. Posture unchanged. The light moves to the back seat. Checks the position there. Then returns to the driver's window. Mark Reynolds gestures outward. Ethan opens the door and steps onto the shoulder. The ground is uneven. There is no streetlight. The patrol car sits behind the sedan at an angle. Its lights remain active. Face the vehicle. Mark Reynolds says. Ethan turns as directed. He keeps his hands visible. He removes his credentials and holds them at chest level. Mark Reynolds takes them without comment and turns away. The distance between them increases. The red indicator on Mark Reynolds' body camera remains on. Ethan stays where he is told. Facing the sedan. The passenger door opens. Caleb exits the vehicle and walks around the front. He stops several feet behind Ethan. Stay there. Mark Reynolds says without turning around. Caleb stops. He waits. The dash clock advances to 11:48. From the patrol car. A door opens and closes. Mark Reynolds returns. The credentials are still in his hand. Hands on the vehicle. He says. Ethan turns and places his palms flat on the trunk. The metal is cold. He spreads his fingers evenly and keeps them still. Caleb remains standing behind him. Hands down at his sides. No instruction is given to him. Mark Reynolds does not look at Ethan's face. His attention stays on the placement of Ethan's hands and shoulders. He steps closer. The distance narrows. A remark follows. It does not concern paperwork. It does not concern verification. It concerns tone. Caleb speaks once. What's the issue here? Mark Reynolds looks at him briefly. I'm not talking to you. His attention returns to Ethan. Another remark follows. It does not change the posture of anyone involved. The patrol car radio remains silent. The dash clock advances again. 11:49. 11:50. Ethan adjusts his weight slightly to maintain balance on the shoulder. His palms remain flat. His fingers do not move. He does not turn his head. Mark Reynolds steps closer again. The space between them reduces to less than an arm's length. A sentence is spoken that does not describe a procedure. It offers resolution only if a role is denied. Ethan does not comply. He answers once. The answer is short. It does not add information. It does not explain. Mark Reynolds looks back toward his patrol car. He looks down the empty highway. He looks again at Ethan's hands. Stay right there. He says, both of you. He turns and walks back toward the patrol car. The credentials go with him. The lights remain active. The engine continues to idle. Inside the sedan, Daniel Ross remains upright. His wrists stay secured. His eyes remain forward. No one opens the rear door. No one addresses him. The dash clock advances to 11:53. Then 11:54. No verification occurs. No release is given. Ethan remains in position. Caleb remains behind him. Still without instruction. The patrol car door opens and closes again. Mark Reynolds remains near the front of his vehicle. He does not approach. He does not speak. The dash clock advances to 11:56. A vehicle passes in the distance and does not slow down. Ethan's hands remain on the trunk. His shoulders stay level. He does not look back. He does not speak. Caleb shifts his stance once and settles again. He remains where he was told to stay. Inside the sedan, Daniel Ross does not change position. His breathing remains steady. The space around him stays closed. The patrol car radio emits no sound. At 11:58, the dash clock changes again. The vehicles do not move. At midnight, the display flips over. The numbers change. Nothing else does. The credentials are not returned. The record has not arrived. The patrol car radio activates. Static breaks. Then a call sign. Mark Reynolds stands near the front of his vehicle. One hand on the door frame, the other holding the credentials. He does not look back toward Ethan Walker. Ethan remains with his palms on the trunk. The position has not changed. The metal stays cold. His fingers remain spread. Behind him, Caleb Walker stands where he was told to stay. His posture is neutral. His hands remain down. He does not approach. He does not speak. The radio continues. Short exchanges. Numbers are read out. A response follows that does not come with instructions. The dash clock inside the sedan advances to 12:01. Mark Reynolds responds on the radio. His voice is controlled. The words are brief. He turns his head slightly, as if listening, then answers again. The credentials remain in his hand. Ethan does not move. A second radio transmission comes through. Mark Reynolds shifts his stance. He looks down the highway, then back toward his patrol car. He does not walk toward Ethan. The radio goes quiet. The credentials stay in Reynolds' hand. Mark Reynolds closes the patrol car door and walks back toward the sedan. He stops several feet away from Ethan, just outside arm's reach. "Still need you to stay put," he says. Ethan does not respond. His hands remain on the trunk. Mark Reynolds looks at the placement of Ethan's palms. He adjusts his position slightly, moving closer to the rear quarter panel. The distance narrows again. The radio says, "You're in the system." Mark Reynolds says, the statement is flat. It does not come with acknowledgement. He does not return the credentials. Caleb speaks once. "If it's confirmed, what's the next step?" Mark Reynolds turns his head. "I didn't ask you." His attention returns to Ethan. Ethan remains facing forward. "If there's a directive," he says, "state it." Mark Reynolds does not answer that. He looks back toward his patrol car, then toward the empty road. The dash clock advances to 12:03. The radio activates again. A different voice this time. Fewer words. Mark Reynolds responds once. He listens. His posture changes only enough to adjust his footing. He walks back to the patrol car, leaving Ethan in position. The credentials go with him again. The radio continues. The exchange lasts longer than before. Inside the sedan, Daniel Ross remains upright. His wrists stay secured. His eyes remain forward. The rear door stays closed. Ethan's shoulders remain level. His hands do not move. His breathing stays steady. No instruction comes from behind him. Caleb shifts his stance once, then settles. He remains where he was told to stay. The radio falls silent. Mark Reynolds exits the patrol car and walks back toward the sedan. His pace is steady. He stops closer this time. "I've got confirmation," he says. The words land without effect. The credentials are still not returned. "What are you doing here tonight?" Mark Reynolds asks. Ethan answers once. The answer is factual. It does not elaborate. Mark Reynolds listens, then looks down at the credentials in his hand. He flips them once, then looks back at Ethan. "That doesn't change the situation," he says. The dash clock advances to 12:06. Caleb speaks again. Briefly, "What's the holdup?" Mark Reynolds looks at him. "You're making this harder." He turns back to Ethan. "You want this to go smoothly." Mark Reynolds says. Ethan does not respond. Mark Reynolds steps closer. The distance is closer to less than an arm's length again. "I need you to admit something," he says. Ethan remains silent. Mark Reynolds waits. No instruction comes from the radio. No one approaches from either direction on the highway. The dash clock advances to 12:08. Mark Reynolds looks back toward his patrol car and speaks into the radio again. This time longer. His tone changes only in pace. He waits for a response. A reply comes through. Short. Direct. Mark Reynolds listens. He nods once. He turns back toward Ethan. Supervisor's on the way. He says. The statement changes the frame. It does not change the posture. The credentials remain in his hand. Ethan stays in position. Caleb remains behind him. Daniel remains in the back seat. The patrol car lights remain active. The engine idles. The shoulder stays unlit. The dash clock advances to 12:10. Mark Reynolds steps away from Ethan and returns to the patrol car. He leans against the hood and waits. He does not speak again. Time continues to pass. At 12, headlights appear in the distance. They grow brighter, then slow. A second patrol car pulls onto the shoulder behind Mark Reynolds' vehicle. The engine shuts off. A door opens. Footsteps approach. Mark Reynolds straightens. He does not move toward Ethan. The second officer stops near the patrol car. He looks at Ethan's hands on the trunk. He looks at the sedan. He looks at Mark Reynolds. What do we have? The second officer asks. Mark Reynolds answers. His words are short. He gestures toward the sedan. He gestures toward Ethan. He does not hand over the credentials. The second officer looks at Ethan. He looks at Caleb. He looks at the back seat, hands still on the vehicle. Mark Reynolds says, Ethan remains where he is. The second officer nods once. He does not intervene. The dash clock advances to 12:14. The record exists now. It has not closed anything. Discretion remains active. The second patrol car idles behind Mark Reynolds' vehicle. Its lights are on. Angled toward the shoulder, the road remains open. But no one passes close by. Mark Reynolds stands near the front of his patrol car. The credentials are still in his hand. He does not approach Ethan Walker. Ethan remains with his palms on the trunk. The position has not changed. The metal is still cold. His fingers remain spread. Behind him, Caleb Walker stays where he was told to remain. He does not move forward. He does not speak. The second officer shifts his attention between the two vehicles. He looks at Ethan's hands on the trunk. He looks at the back seat of the sedan. He looks at Mark Reynolds. The radio activates again. A voice comes through. Clearer than before. Fewer words. Direct. Mark Reynolds responds once. He listens. His posture changes just enough to acknowledge the instruction. He walks toward Ethan, hands off the vehicle. He says. Ethan removes his palms from the trunk and turns slightly, keeping his hands visible. He does not step away. Mark Reynolds extends the credentials and returns them. The transfer is brief. No explanation follows. Stand by the vehicle. Mark Reynolds says. Ethan steps one pace to the side and stops. Caleb remains behind him. No further instruction is given to either of them. The second officer steps forward. He speaks to Mark Reynolds in a low voice. The exchange is short. The radio remains on. The dashboard clock inside the sedan advances to 12:18. Mark Reynolds turns back toward Ethan. You're free to continue, he says. Ethan nods once. He does not comment. Caleb moves first. He walks back toward the passenger side of the sedan. Ethan follows, maintaining distance. Neither rushes. Inside the back seat, Daniel Ross remains upright. His wrists are still secured. He looks forward. The rear door opens. Ethan checks the restraints. The position remains unchanged. The door closes. Ethan and Caleb enter the sedan. The engine shifts into gear. The car signals and pulls back onto the highway. The patrol cars remain on the shoulder. Their lights stay on as the sedan departs. The dash clock advances to 12:20. The sedan continues down Highway 95. The road remains empty. The engine maintains a steady speed. No one speaks inside the car. Several miles later, Ethan reaches for the radio mounted near the console. He makes one call. The exchange is brief. Time and location are stated. The delay is noted. The call ends. The sedan continues. The next morning, Ethan completes a report. The timeline is listed. The stop is documented. The delay is recorded. The body camera footage is requested. Caleb submits a statement. Daniel Ross's transfer log is updated to reflect the interruption. The materials are reviewed internally. Then, it was reviewed again. The footage is watched without sound. Then with sound, the sequence is noted. The questions focus on timing, on commands given, on actions taken after confirmation. Weeks pass. A formal notice arrives. An investigation is opened. Additional footage is requested. Radio logs are pulled. Dispatch records are compared to timestamps. Mark Reynolds is placed on administrative leave. Depositions are taken. The footage is shown again. The same moments are paused. The same commands are replayed. The credentials are being held. The radio confirms identity. The posture is not changing. A settlement is discussed. It is declined. The case goes to trial. The jury sees the footage. They hear the audio. They review the timeline. The verdict is returned. The city is held liable. Damages are awarded. The amount is recorded. Mark Reynolds' employment is terminated. His certification is revoked. He does not return to patrol. The department updates its procedures. Verification protocols are revised. Training materials are adjusted. Ethan and Caleb return to their assignments. Their names do not appear in press conferences. Their work continues. Daniel Ross has been relocated. His case proceeds on a separate track. The footage remains available. It is cited in filings. It is referenced in training. It exists independent of commentary. The record is closed. Discretion is no longer active. Quiet justice. If you've watched this far, you already understand why these moments matter. Not because of how they feel, but because of how they are recorded. If you've seen situations like this, share the story. If you want more breakdowns of power, procedure, and accountability, leave a comment below. And if you want to keep following cases where record meets discretion, subscribe to Power Abuse Stories.